this whole situation in Ukraine, it has been amazing me from day one. I mean, there's so many things that don't seem to add up. Um, I think if I say that this war has been started by elites, you probably agree with me. There is something I don't understand. There seems to be, and you said that several times, we have severely underestimated the Russians, I think. Do you have any idea how this? I mean, I'm an intelligence officer, and I was a good one. Um, I know that those elites we're talking about have better people than almost any army in the world. How could we have been mistaken so much in Russia's capabilities in Ukraine? Do you have any idea?
I think it's fair to say that every major crisis or conflict in the history of the United States usually begins in the same way, with amnesia. You have people that categorically dismiss the importance of systematically studying the region where you're going to operate, understanding the potential opponent. There is no interest in other people's interests. Yeah, Washington and the globalist community that is in Europe, ruling today in Germany and France and other places, doesn't care about interests. They are pursuing what they think is an ideological objective to bring down this Russian state that will not open its borders, that will not abandon its national identity, and essentially prostrate itself before the West, be part of our financial hegemony as well as our military hegemony.
Yep.
That's the easiest way to think of it. Now, you're raising an important point. Somebody somewhere along the line must have had some sense and said, "Wait a minute, we don't. What is your real objective?" And they say, "Well, the real objective is to harm Russia, bring down Putin." Well, it reminds me of Anthony Eden in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. He told Field Marshal Montgomery, who then I think was the uh, chief of the Imperial General Staff, or perhaps he'd already retired at that stage. He said, "We're going to go into Egypt." And Montgomery said, "Why? For what purpose?" And he said, "To knock Nasser off his perch." And Montgomery said, "Well, that's absurd. Doesn't make any sense. How do you plan to achieve that? What are you trying to create in the country? Chaos, civil disorder? You want it to disintegrate? Because those are real possibilities based upon what you just said. And let's set aside a minute whether or not it's actually attainable. Why would the rest of the world sit there while you did this? Obviously it fell on deaf ears. Anthony Eden pressed ahead. They went into the Suez, and what happened? Disaster.
Disaster.
The
Yep.
whole thing was a mess. They weren't prepared. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. In that case, they grossly overestimated the Egyptians, but they failed to prepare the groundwork. They didn't have a plan. They didn't know what the specific objectives were other than we want to get rid of Nasser. Well, we're in the same position now. And of course, Anthony Eden was reliving, his views of Hitler in the 1930s, which had absolutely nothing to do with Nasser or the Suez. We are similarly inclined today to see Putin as a Stalinist figure. The Russian army is another Soviet imitation. It's all wrong. It makes no sense.
True.
But I think behind all of it, there are a group of very wealthy people. You in the East, you call them oligarchs. We we can talk about hedge fund billionaires. They have an interest in getting access to Russia's enormous resources.
Yep.
So whatever they can do to bring down the regime and fragment the country is, in their estimation, monetarily rewarding. Now, that's a sick notion in my judgment,
Yep.
but I think that's also played a role in all of this. And then remember, we Americans don't pay much attention to what happens overseas. Unless you kill 1,000 of us on a particular day somewhere beyond America's borders, Americans don't pay attention.
Okay.
And this has been the problem for 60 years. It's disastrous.
It's true. Because what's happening right now is that we're completely depleting NATO, I think. And as you mentioned in various interviews, I mean, how much breath do we still have being NATO to continue
I
this?
don't think there's much left. If you
It's
go back to an interview that I did with Dimitri Simes in January, actually, I think it was his co-host George Beebe, former CIA officer. It was in January before this whole thing got started, and they were asking people to make predictions. Well, one of my predictions, like so many others, was wrong. And that was, I said the Russians absolutely go in. I was correct. I said that by the time this is over, NATO will collapse. I said that in January of 2022.
mm-hmm.
The one thing that I got wrong, and I think a lot of us did, was that the Russians would go in as carefully, deliberately, and slowly and cautiously as turned out to be the case.
Yep.
Of course, we were not on receipt of the Russian General Staff's instructions from the president. And Putin, who really didn't want a war, who is really trying to do something that you should never do as a head of state, which is, quote unquote, send signals. He was trying to signal the West. He had no idea how corrupt and venal the globalist elites dominating Europe and the United States really were, and how absolutely outrageously hostile they were. I don't think he ever anticipated that. He thought that once this got started, that people would stand up and say, look, we don't want a war in Europe. I remember when I was an officer in the 1990s, the 1980s, but specifically in the 90s, and then along came the Kosovo Air Campaign, and I stood around talking to some of your colleagues in the Dutch forces, as well as the Germans and the French and others, and they all said privately, we thought NATO existed to prevent the outbreak of another war in Europe, not start one.
Yep.
Well, welcome to reality. This is from the beginning been engineered by Washington with support from London and Paris. And the Europeans are going to pay a terrible price. The sooner they wake up to this reality, and frankly, I think throw us out, the better off they will be. But that's an issue for them to resolve.
But the point is that you probably saw it at the beginning. I saw it at the beginning that Putin went in a way that was not as expected. I mean, you knew, I knew that he could roll over Ukraine within 5 seconds. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, it wouldn't have been
No, I
difficult for
understand.
him.
Yeah.
And he didn't. So that was, as you say, like signaling, like this is not what I want. And we didn't react. We reacted in an opposite way. Boris Johnson even blocked a peace offering that could have been on the table, etc., etc. Then we started to send arms, which we are sending completely in vain because the Ukrainians are getting massacred. I mean, your estimate is like 350,000 to even 400,000 dead, and there are even higher estimates. Then we have to calculate with the wounded people. I mean, I think close to 1 million Ukrainian fighting age people are now out of the battlefield. It's incredible. We're getting
And the thing that's so disturbing to me is that no one seems to care. I know that no one in Washington cares whatsoever. Now, I grew up with Ukrainians in North Philadelphia, and I loved them. I thought they were great people.
Yep.
I also grew up with some Poles and Lithuanians and others. I was the odd man out because I didn't fit into any of those categories. But that's one of the reasons that I ultimately went to Europe to study in Germany. I was so enthralled by the people that I met, and they were equally enthralled with the Germans.
Yep.
And then I became interested because, of course, with the time we were facing the Russians. So, I was trying from the very beginning to understand all of these individuals and all of these people. I'm not sure I ever completely grasped it, but I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. No one in Washington understands any of it.
Well,
They
the main point is that when I went to Afghanistan, I'm the longest serving military soldier in Afghanistan, and I served for 2 years there. And I was an intelligence officer, but I served outside the gates always. And my point was to live in the heads of our opponents. I mean, that was what I thought was my work, to try to understand them till the very smallest detail. And I tried everything I could to live in their shoes, to walk their walk and to talk their talk, and I succeeded. Um, that way I could properly inform my superiors, which was my job. Right now, I see the exact opposite. So I completely agree with you. We completely don't understand Russian culture and Russian despotism and Russian whatever is there. We simply don't understand it, and we're eating ourselves at this moment. But then you mentioned, I'm so sorry because we have only 40 minutes, so I have to rush a bit through my
Sure.
questions, and it could be that we're disconnected. So in that case, if I haven't a chance to properly thank you, I'll be doing it
That's
right
fine.
now.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Poland, and in an interview I saw with you, you said something in the gist of what's NATO is doing right now hinges on what the Polish government is doing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the government in Warsaw has been very hostile to Russia from the first moment. And they are caught up in this emotional hysteria that on the one hand, Russia is evil and any Russian has to be destroyed. And on the other hand, they see themselves as the inevitable imperial masters of much of Ukraine and Belarusia. I think that's falling apart right now. In fact, I received some information this morning from my friends in Poland telling me that 52% of Poles have now essentially said, we want nothing to do with the war in Ukraine.
Okay.
Some say, well, we'll send support and assistance. But our real interest in Poland right now is to get millions of Ukrainians out of Poland.
Okay.
So that's a big change. So I think it's going to be very hard now for the Poles to be an American stalking horse, because effectively that's what we tried to do with Ukraine. They were a stalking horse. Let's push and push and push, see how far we can go to the border with Russia. And if we can put troops and missiles and equipment out there in the east that will threaten Russia, that's a good thing. Then we can bully Russia. We forgot we weren't dealing with Iraq. We weren't dealing with any of these sort of artificial constructs as opposed to real nation states. Russia is a real place. So, now we're paying a terrible price. But I think we're learning, and I think Americans are learning, because they look and they say, we have so many people in the United States who need help and support. Why are we sending billions to Ukraine? It's a very simplistic formula, but it's working.
Yep. See your point. Um, what will Russia do? I mean, they can't. I mean, if I analyze their actions right now, they're like pushing in small ways. They're advancing their front a little bit. They dig in and they wait for the Ukrainians to come for them, and then they insulate them. They attack with very small infantry units backed up by tanks. I think they play a very uh, thought out game. It's not so bad what they're doing. Um, what will be the decisive moment that Putin says this is it? Because I read the statements from the Felicius, what was it, the meeting, the NATO meeting we just had, and NATO is still on the same as the same point of view, like Russia's bad and we only accept a total retreat, and that will not happen. So in your opinion, where in the end will this lead? Will they march on to Poland, or I mean, do you see any perspective here?
Well, keep in mind that the last thing that Vladimir Putin wants is to govern Ukrainians. So he'd rather not cross that river and march west. That was never his plan.
No.
If you look at the areas where the Russian forces are currently sitting, those are historically Russian areas, and that's where the Russian speakers live.
Yep.
He has always said that Kharkov and Odessa would
Mm-hmm.
once again be Russian cities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that will happen. There's no question about that. I think at the same time, he's watching to see what the West is going to do. He sees Scholz in Berlin in an extremely fragile position. Scholz has an approval rating of about 31%. The German electorate says it wants a new government. I think the Germans have finally discovered that they're not only headed into a deep recession, but they're being deindustrialized. Their scientific industrial power is being destroyed. And again, the Germans are saying, well, we were never really consulted, were we? No one asked us whether or not we wanted to declare war. Instead, you had all these emotional outbursts from, this woman Baerbock, who is absurd, who refused to shake the hand of Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. It was just childish nonsense. And all of this, Moscow's watching and saying, well, how long before Scholz is gone? How long before Macron is gone? If they can get rid, I'm saying the Europeans, if they can get rid of those two, then I think you may have some governments that will come forward and say that's enough.
Yep.
And then you have Washington, and Washington is stuck in a swamp of its own creation. No one wants to retreat from ridiculous statements and policy positions. No one wants to step forward and say, this was a real mistake. By the way, we lied to you, and we've been lying to you for months. Right now there are 37 Ukrainian brigades, we think roughly 37, all along the defensive line from the southeast, I would say, to the northeast. We think the Ukrainians may have 6 brigades in reserve. 6 brigades amounts to what? 24,000. A little over 100,000 Ukrainians sitting in these defensive positions where obviously they are being hammered on a routine basis and dying every day. At the same time, the Russians have 300,000 troops in reserve. And Putin has always been reluctant to commit that reserve and bring this to a rapid close because he's afraid that we will then suddenly convince everyone in NATO to go into Western Ukraine. And if that happens, then he's got a war in his hands that he really never wanted, but he is then compelled to win it.
Yep.
Can't back away. He can't allow this rump state that may emerge from this experience to be part of NATO. From the very beginning, Ukraine should have been neutral, had no business being part of NATO. He knows that. So I think it's really a matter for decision by Vladimir Putin. And I think he's watching all of these things before he commits forces. And lastly, and I know a lot of people don't believe this, but this is true, he doesn't want to kill any more Ukrainians. They are Slavs and Orthodox Christian Slavs. He's not interested in killing them.
I agree. I predicted a long time ago that more or less what you're saying right now, he would consent to the eastern part of Ukraine, but then what with the western part of Ukraine? I mean, he would still demand neutrality of that part of Ukraine. And
absolutely,
as I read the last statement of NATO, they're clearly not willing to give him that. So that puts us in a very difficult position. Then I'm with you. Putin doesn't want this war. He doesn't want to kill Ukrainians. He wants to end this yesterday, but obviously he can't. Just to jump to another topic, I mean, the Netherlands were running front to now deliver F-16s to Ukraine. They have not yet been delivered. They have been promised. Denmark did the same. Will that impress Putin in any way?
No. He knows that those F-16s, without airborne warning and control systems, these are the aircraft with extraordinary communications capability and radars. They're the ones that target for all of the aircraft. You're talking about a very complex operation. So this is not going to arrive before this comes to an end, in my judgment. It's not going to change anything. I think it's very foolish.
So do I. First of all, they have to train the pilots, of course, which they will do after they have had a course of 1 month to learn to speak English, which I think is ridiculous. It's true. I'm not joking here. But then we need all the support for those F-16s, and they don't even have a runway long enough to facilitate those aircraft. So these are as well completely ridiculous decisions. I think you said it somewhere that the military genius have been put out of this operation. It's now politicians that decide, and there are no military people any longer involved.
Well, I would be careful not to absolve the senior military leaders of responsibility for the debacle. There were lots of senior officers in NATO, American and British, and possibly others who had very crazy ideas about how to fight. They are living, unfortunately, from what I've seen, in the last year of World War II, which they don't even understand. You know, what we're seeing is something very similar to what happened to the Germans in the last year of the war.
Yeah.
Something Rommel tried very hard to persuade people of, and they wouldn't listen. And that was very simply the following: they didn't have adequate air and missile defenses. And so their armor formations, if they were discovered, were absolutely destroyed by air power, air supremacy, by thousands upon thousands of fighters and bombers. So this is what the Ukrainians face. They don't have the air and missile defense to protect their forces on the ground. So they're in a hopeless position. They are still alive at all because the Russians have chosen not to attack. But when they do, this will be over, I suspect. I just, again, I think Putin is being careful, but he's also looking for opportunity. The thing I worry about is that we will be stupid and think that his reluctance to attack and end this on purely military terms is a sign of weakness. It's not.
I'm with you. The decision of the US to deliver cluster weapons, will that affect? I mean, you said something about that Great Britain, at least, and France and Germany were now like getting a little bit reluctant about that, which will lead probably, hopefully, to some sort of division within NATO. What do you think about that?
Well, my own experience with cluster munitions is that they're very effective against soft targets, human beings, wheeled vehicles, wheeled armor. They have no impact whatsoever on tanks and other heavy equipment. And they're a nuisance because about 10 to 15% of the time you have duds. That means that you've got to go out and police these things after it's over. And I saw there were many, many injuries after the Gulf War because children, Arabs, went out there and didn't know what they were dealing with and were harmed. And I think that's one of the reasons everybody said, well, this is not worth the investment. We can do business better. But remember, we'd run out of artillery ammunition.
Yep.
We don't have the scientific industrial base that we once did. We don't have a surge capacity.
And then you claim, and you're right, I mean, Russia changed quickly into like a war economy, and they are supplying themselves in a great manner. They're even, as far as I know, right now using kamikaze drones to attack the infantry, Ukrainian infantry. They have unlimited artillery shells, I think they have, and then they have their Kinzhal rockets that they up produced. Any shortages there?
Well, it's similar to Napoleon when he arrived at Borodino, who was stunned by the fact that the Russian army at Borodino outside of Moscow had more artillery than he did. He was used to encountering opposing forces that had less artillery than he did and didn't know how to employ it. Well, the Russians knew how to do that. All I'm trying to say is that every conceivable miscalculation based on prejudice, stupidity, bad assumptions, emotion, hostility by this small elite that's in charge. Because remember, the average American could care less.
The average
American has been told, oh, Russians are bad. We've been hearing that for 60 years.
Yep.
Now, that's nonsense now. That Russia changed profoundly in the 90s and is absolutely not the Soviet state that it once was. But again, nobody hears that.
Still there, or did we lose the connection?
I'm here.
Okay, sorry. Let me quickly go through my questions.
I hope you got your eye on the clock.
Yes, we got still 10 minutes or something.
Good,
but the only thing is that I hope to be able to say goodbye and thank you before we're cut off. Let me check. I think I'm through the bulk of it. What do you think because we talked about the divisions that the Ukrainians still have. What do you think amounts to the total force of Ukrainians that are now combat ready?
Well, again, if you have 37 brigades stretched over several hundred kilometers, and each of those brigades is undoubtedly under strength, they're not at full strength.
Nope.
The only full strength brigades may be the 6 or 7 still in reserve. So let's overestimate their capability and say that they've got 28,000 troops that can still fight, that are well equipped, that are sitting in reserve. But again, what's their air and missile defense? It's almost
Nothing.
non-existent.
It's gone.
Can't fight that way.
Nope.
It's suicide.
And then there's another thing that more and more troops are reserves. I mean, the hardcore veterans, they're quite limited because they've mostly died, and so most of those brigades exist of reserve personnel. Am I right?
Oh, I think so. And a large numbers of them are over 40.
Yeah.
There are people out there over 50. And then you have the usual roundup of boys who are only 15, 16, 17. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's unnecessary. It should stop. We could stop it. Washington could stop all of this. But egos are too large. No one wants to admit, oh, I was wrong. So thousands of Ukrainians have to die. I keep asking, how many more Ukrainians have to die pointlessly before we put an end to this? I guess more.
Yeah, because if the Dutch government promises F-16s for after the winter, they're planning on a prolongation of this madness for at least half a year. And it's very hard to see full-grown politicians talk about this war as if it's a Disney production. Is horrible. Do you
Well,
see
that's a
any?
good analogy. That's a very good analogy, a Disney production, because that's about what it means to them. They have
Yeah.
no idea what they're dealing with. You have 60,000 plus amputees.
Oh man.
It's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah. Yeah, it's ridiculous, and it's going on, and they don't stand a chance at all. Is there anything in your mind that could lead to a solution? I mean, just thinking out of the box, what could we do?
I've suggested that we suspend all aid immediately to all military aid, and that we convene some sort of negotiating talks somewhere, neutral ground, wherever anybody wants it, and try to find out, first of all, what is it that the Russians want? You know, we've never listened to the Russians. We come in, just as we did with the Chinese a couple of years ago, and these ideologues who think that they have the world by the tail and that the whole world should bow down and worship them
Yeah.
because they're the globalist elites.
Yeah.
They want the world without borders, the world with, out the rule of law, whatever it is that they want. And they think that they can bully, and they can't. So I don't know what we can do in the short run. You'd have to sweep the government out of power. We have no means of doing that. We have this process that's very different from your own. Definitely, these people need to go, and I think they know that probably by 2024, the end of it, if we get that far without more serious crises, that they'll be out of power. They'll be finished. But you have a different system. You have a parliamentary system, so you can rid yourself of these disasters quite quickly.
No, you can't, because the elites control the media. So I mean,
but you got to get people to stop believing the media.
I know it. That's what I'm trying. It's my job to create a new kind of media, and but it's very difficult. I mean, what's happening in Europe right now, and you probably saw that in the news, that all these countries like Spain and Italy and recently Sweden, and they choose a right wing government, but basically it's the same. It's the same way of politics. They all apply to the 2030 agenda. It's all the same, but it's new faces and nothing changes. So you have to make a shift for system politics. You have to
Well, I think you hit something that's very important. We have the same problem here. The faces change, but the policies don't. Now, I also laugh at this far right business. There's nothing far right about the AFD or any of these parties. That's crazy nonsense. It may be that we all have to go through turmoil. In other words, one or two more governments. Look at Britain. How many prime ministers have they had? This man Sunak's not going to last much longer. The situation over there is catastrophic.
Yep.
Britain is sinking into poverty, for God's sakes.
I lived there for a year.
It's unbelievable. So this isn't going to last, and we may have to go through turnover, and then it will end. I think by then we shall probably have pulled out. We are not going to stay everywhere around the globe forever. And now that's what the globalists would like. They think the world is their oyster, and it's nonsense.
Yeah, but the problem I have, I don't know where you stand on that because we're deviating from the subject, but it's not a problem. We still have like 8 minutes, so why not? What I'm afraid of is the whole digitalization of the world. I mean, there will be a time soon, especially in Europe, where we are no longer free to even we will adopt to the same system as in China. They're trying very hard, which is a different warfare that's going on, and whatever is happening in Ukraine keeps our attention there, while it should be on what's really happening in Europe, and it won't last long before we will find ourselves in a digital prison from
Well,
which there will
remember,
be.
remember that the culture in China is different.
Mhm.
People all the time are trying to make China into a big boogeyman. The truth is, it's a Confucian society. Conformity is the law. Social behavior is driven by conformity.
Yeah,
Not very different in Korea and in Japan. If you look at the probability of a conviction of a crime in a court in China, it's about 99%. Well, it's about 99% in Japan, 99% in Vietnam. Of course, in North Korea, it's 100%. But my point is these nations are very similar. This kind of thing works for them. The population supports it. We don't. I don't think we do. I know very well that my ancestors would roil at this sort of thing.
I know.
So this is a real danger to us, and we have to deal with it because these people, you're right, these globalists in power, if they can create some sort of surveillance system and then punish anybody who says or does anything they don't like is real. I don't think it'll work here in the United States because, frankly speaking, there are too many Americans like me who won't conform, and we're armed.
That's the problem. We are not. That's the big problem. I know why you are armed. That's exactly to avoid situations like this or the situation that's developing. But we don't have that. And I feel in Europe that people don't care any longer. So what? Then we take a digital passport. So what? We put the WHO in charge of our health. It doesn't matter. I mean, the fight is taken out of people. And I understand. I mean, if I see how the generation after us has been raised, I mean, we quite effectively took the spirit out of them, and that doesn't leave us much to fight with.
Well, your farmers have manifested some real character and tried to
As
divert
a,
the from this dangerous path.
yeah, but that's a misconception. I mean, they went out to protest, but right now in November they get a chance to choose, and they will choose for a certain farmer party. But this farmer party is just equal to they support the 2030 agenda. They support the WEF. I mean, everything remains the same,
Hmm.
and that the reason is that people don't take the time to properly inform themselves about what's happening, and we're misinformed by the media. So it's very hard. I'm like I mean, sorry to say so, but quite I'm pissing into the wind. I mean, the people
Well,
simply
there are many Americans who worry about the same thing. I am more optimistic here
okay.
because I think there are still lots of Americans, at least 70, 80 million of us, who absolutely will not conform to this nonsense. I don't know what the situation is in Europe. I am encouraged by some of the things I've seen in France. And I am always recall Metternich, the great foreign minister of Austria, who said, when someone in Paris sneezes, Europe catches a cold. I am hopeful that the French, strangely enough, may be the catalyst for change.
Yeah, could
We'll
very
have to.
well be so. It's let's hope for it. I'm very thankful for you to have taken the time to talk to me.
We have people committed to outcomes who disregard the process that could facilitate the outcome or could reveal that the outcome is impossible. So it's outcome over process. Who's going to stand up and say, well, that's ridiculous, can't be done? And I think that's our biggest problem, particularly for people in uniform. And there are too many people in uniform that have swallowed the Kool-Aid,
Mm-hmm.
this crazy ideology. I run into people, all the Russians of this. I said, have you been to Russia? Now, I haven't been in Russia since 2001, but it was very clear to me in 2001 that this Russia had a lot more in common with the Russia of Nicholas I
Mm-hmm.
or Nicholas II or Alexander II than it did with the Soviet Union. And I found that very reassuring. And, Solzhenitsyn said, the Russian soul belongs to God, not to the state. And I really like that formulation. And I wish Americans and Europeans would adopt it and make it clear the state doesn't own us. They don't own our children. They don't own anything. Yeah. And if you put a stop to this nonsense in Russia, that's the first giant step in the direction of rationality and reason and an end to the state domination that we all live under.
Well, we simply don't seem to learn from our mistakes. I mean, the Dutch military in Afghanistan, for example, they made a huge clusterfuck of it. I mean, it was horrible what they did. They bombed the hell out of people for nothing just by not understanding the Afghan people. I mean, as you say, it was an outcome-driven mission.
Yeah, but I think, again, that's our fault because we dragged you in and we didn't know what we were doing. It's back to the Suez crisis.
Yeah.
What are we trying to achieve? And you start pushing hard. One quick anecdote for you. I think it was in '68. President Lyndon Baines Johnson sent General Bradley, the 5-star from the Second World War, to Vietnam to make an assessment. Bradley came back, met him in the Oval Office, and said, "All right, I can't find anyone from the rank of company commander, captain, all the way up to 4-star general who knows what the hell they're doing. They haven't figured out what we're there for." Yeah. And LBJ said, "Well, it's impossible, General. We're there to bring freedom and all this other nonsense." And finally, he said, "Well, listen, that's not good enough. We need a tangible, concrete objective." So he took a legal pad and a pen and said, "Here, Mr. President, write the mission and write the objective." And Johnson sat there and said, "Well, this is going to take me a long time." He said, "If you can't do it quickly, get out."